If you ever turn on the news, you'll hear it. Democracy is in grave danger. Let's have a look.
Is democracy still America's sacred cause?
Democracy and values, they are part of our DNA. And that's true.
Democracy is under assault. He's taking a wrecking ball to our founding fathers' historic project.
To our founding fathers' historic project. The conventional belief is that the Constitution created a democracy. People vote, the majority rules, the common man decides. This is supposedly the essence of America. But, to be honest, that's not quite right. America was not supposed to be a democracy. Many of the founders were in fact deeply skeptical, if not outright opposed to democracy and mass politics. That is why, in the early United States, ordinary citizens were not allowed to vote for the president or even the Senate. And yes, that was even true for white men. American democracy, as we understand it today, where we have big federal elections with a lot of sensation and mass participation, was in reality something that slowly evolved over many decades, and absolutely not something that our founding fathers ever intended. If you're surprised or even skeptical, great, then you're in for an interesting video. So join me today as we'll uncover the forgotten history of American democracy. First, we'll go back to Washington, Jefferson, and so on to understand the foundation that they laid after the Revolution and how democracy wasn't created but evolved. Second, we'll zoom out and ask a bigger question. There's so much talk about democracy being in danger, but do we really even live in a democracy in the first place? And finally, we'll get more abstract and maybe even a bit edgy. If democracy is in crisis, why do we need it and how do we fix it? But before we get to our modern day, let me surprise you one more time. Many people nowadays imagine the founding fathers as these battle-hardened, rugged men of the people who rose up from the common folk to build a democracy. This notion, however, is false. Yes, many of them were very battle-hardened, but they weren't noble savages. Actually, they were some of the richest, best-educated men in the colonies, from the highest strata of early American society. Historians often describe them as a kind of American aristocracy, not in the medieval European sense of the word, implying that they had titles with hereditary nobility, but in the ancient Greek sense of the word, aristokratia, rule of the best. Effectively, they were a small, privileged ruling class calling the shots. As the famous American historian Peter Fierek put it, for the crucial first 6 decades, the American government was a closed, hierarchical government by gentlemen. Power alternated between two rival groups of almost equally conservative gentlemen, Hamilton's elite of northern merchants versus Jefferson's elite of intellectual lawyers and southern planters, the aristocratic origin of American freedom. Indeed, the so-called Virginia planters, where 4 of the first 5 presidents came from, were extraordinarily wealthy individuals, part self-made and part hereditary. George Washington's wealth, for example, is estimated to have been close to $1 billion in modern dollars. He had land roughly 3 times the size of the island of Manhattan, plantations with many, many slaves, and the largest whiskey distillery in America at the time. Interestingly, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are considered to be the richest presidents ever, only after Trump. The other competing faction in the early days, Alexander Hamilton being the most notable one, comprised of northern merchants, lawyers, and bankers, most of them also highly prosperous. Now, I'm not saying any of this to shame or moralize, as in that they were snobby and entitled. Actually, quite the contrary. I'm saying this to highlight an incredibly important point. The notion that America started as a mass democracy with politics of the rugged common man is nonsense. The founders were very bright, well-read, accomplished, and educated. Much more so, to be honest, than we are nowadays. This also illuminates an important point that gets lost in the egalitarian rhetoric of today. Pretty much every successful society ever was ruled by a small, highly prosperous elite. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because humans are kind of fundamentally unequal in ability. It's only natural to have a handful of people pulling the strings. America's no exception, democracy or not. The much more fascinating question usually is whether a given elite is noble and competent or corrupt and decadent. We'll expand on this later in the video. Enough about the affluence of the founding fathers. What system of government did they actually want? If you'd ask most people on the street, they'd say that the Constitution established democracy. People vote, majority rules, that sort of thing. But we've already said in the video that that's not right. Now, am I on the other hand saying that they wanted a monarchy or a hereditary ruling class? Absolutely not. As often in life, the truth is a bit more nuanced. It is true that many of the founding fathers were quite terrified to be ruled by the emotional masses. Gordon Wood, one of the most respected historians of early American history, said this about James Madison, founding father and 4th president. James Madison continued to believe that ordinary, middling sorts, artisans, traders, commercial farmers, businessmen, could not make good political leaders. They could never act as disinterested umpires among the contending private interests in the society. To put it more simply, Madison basically thought that regular, middle-class people weren't suited to lead because they were too wrapped up in their own interests, unable to stay neutral and fair. Not to bombard you with more random quotes, but here's another, even starker one from John Adams. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. To emphasize, John Adams was a founding father and the second president, which is kind of funny. If you'd say this nowadays on CNN without context, you would be denounced as an authoritarian. But in reality, this quote comes from the second president of the US. Now please understand this, and it's an important disclaimer for the video. I am not quoting this to make an argument for or against democracy. My goal is just to give you an agnostic understanding of the founding spirit and evolution of the American political landscape. Tangent aside, it should be clear at this point that the Constitution was not crafted to create a system of rule by the many. Instead, the founding fathers wanted to build a stable government that would first and foremost protect freedom and individual rights in the long run, and majoritarianism can actually be quite at odds with this. Even more interesting, democracy is not mentioned once, neither in the Declaration of Independence nor in the Constitution. If we take the preamble of the Constitution, the words that stick out are more perfect union, justice, tranquility, welfare, and blessings of liberty. There is also we the people as the first three words, and we'll get to that right away. But for now, we need to draw a line between what the framers called a democracy and what they called a republic. In their vocabulary, a democracy is quite different from what we think of nowadays. They had the ancient Athenian definition in mind. Ordinary citizens, constantly involved in politics, voting directly on laws, pushed by passion and rhetoric in a relatively small city-state or polis, to use the Greek word. To the founders, that sounded like a recipe for disaster, considering the vast size of the 13 colonies. Instead, they opted to create a republican system of governance. John Marshall, founding father and former Chief Justice, put it bluntly: between a balanced republic and a democracy, the difference is like that between order and chaos. Now, before you dislike the video and click away because you think that I'm trying to make a semantic argument about how the meaning of the word democracy evolved from the ancient Greek meaning to republicanism, don't. While the founding fathers did want a representative form of government with elections, it was highly limited and filtered, much more so than what we have nowadays. At the federal level, as we already said, for example, ordinary people were not allowed to vote for the president. They did not vote for their US senator, and they obviously did not vote for the Supreme Court justices. Presidents were chosen by the Electoral College, which, unlike today, wasn't the result of statewide popular votes. In many states, the Electoral College voters were simply appointed by the state legislators and drawn from a small circle of local social elites. So the final choice for president passed through a very narrow elitist filter. Senators were chosen much in the same way by the state assemblies. It was only much later that citizens were allowed to vote for their senators directly. So the only node of power in federal politics where the populace directly participated was the House of Representatives. The main place where we, the people, participated was lower down in local and state elections. And even here, the people usually meant white men who met property or tax requirements. This meant poor or very young white men also weren't able to vote, depending on the state. To summarize this, the founding fathers were a highly educated and affluent elite that prioritized things like liberty and personal rights and were opposed to tyranny. They didn't trust pure democracy or absolute monarchy because both, they thought, tend to end in despotism. However, they weren't authoritarian either because they deemed representation as necessary to ensure liberty. Because as we know, the revolution was fought over no taxation without representation. And so the framers created a filtered republic, with each state required to have a republican form of government. Most elections happened on the state level, from which delegates were sent to the capital. Effectively, the founders wanted a noble elite to represent the people and to guard against both passions of the many and the concentration of the power in the few. And with that, the Constitution was ratified, and George Washington became the first president in 1789. But this begs an important question. How do we get from a system where only property-owning white men voted for either Virginia plantation owners or Northeastern lawyers, financiers, and merchants to a rather egalitarian system with mass participation? You know, think of party conventions before an election that fill up entire stadiums and where the candidate claims to represent the lower and middle class people. Well, to answer that, let me ask you a question. What is the opposite of elitism, the ruling paradigm of the early days? The opposite of elitism is populism. With a few important caveats, populism is what gave rise to mass democracy that we know today. What happened was that the revolution and struggle for independence from Britain planted seeds of egalitarian ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And these aspirations grew stronger as time went on. In the early decades of the Republic, from 1789 to the 1820s, states increasingly loosened the property requirements for white men. That's because it became increasingly awkward to tell tax-paying white men that they couldn't vote because they didn't own enough land. And this process was also amplified when newly admitted states like Kentucky or Tennessee immediately started with pretty wide voting rights to attract settlers. Something else very important also happened. States increasingly allowed voters to choose presidential electors directly, rather than having state assemblies appoint the Electoral College. Which brings us back to populism and the very first monumental shift in American presidential politics. 4 of the first 6 presidents were from the Virginia gentry, and the other 2 were Adams Sr. and Jr., lawyers from New England and all affluent, well-to-do elites, as we've already established. But this changed dramatically with the election of Andrew Jackson, the first populist president, in 1828. He came from one of the newly included Western states and was a successful general in the War of 1812. Although he too became quite wealthy, he didn't come from money, he did not attend university, and he had a much rougher frontiersman personality than the refined and elegant founding fathers. He was an outsider to politics and did something all too familiar nowadays. Just as most politicians today attempt to relate to working class voters, Jackson came to be known as the defender of the common man. His voters saw themselves as the honest, hardworking people of the nation, and they distrusted bankers, merchants, and large business owners. To reiterate, this was a new phenomenon and quite different from the spirit of the founding days. Now, we'll not get into the details of Jacksonian democracy. Instead, I'll leave you with a quite funny anecdote. Many people nowadays think very poorly of him because he essentially deported massive amounts of Native Americans westward, leading to quite a lot of deaths. Others celebrate him as a hero because he was a fan of hard money and against debt. He vehemently fought the Second Bank of the United States and eventually let its charter expire. Andrew Jackson is responsible for us not having another central bank until the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, and it's almost cynical that he's now the face of the $20 Federal Reserve note, which, by the way, is not accepted by many Native American tribes. Anyway, before we digress further, the growth of mass politics of the common man with passionate political campaigns and party machines is often attributed to Andrew Jackson. In the decades after, there were a few crucial amendments passed that greatly altered the American political landscape. With Union victory in the Civil War, Congress passed the 15th Amendment to give African Americans the right to vote. In 1913, the Constitution was amended yet again to allow people to directly vote their senators. Think of how nowadays people vote for Chuck Schumer or Rand Paul. This wasn't possible until 1913. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920. Now let me be very clear on something here. We'll not get into the details of the various civil rights struggles. Not because they're not important, but actually for an entirely different reason. I think these topics are ostensibly discussed in pop culture and Hollywood movies. Also, I think there's a lot of moralizing that comes with it. People dismiss early America as a sexist and racist country, and consequently are kind of ignorant about it, which is fine, but that's quite shallow. I do think we should have more gratitude for where we came from and how far we've come. It's always easy to criticize 250 years later from a position of retrospect. Just as we admire and look up to ancient Athens, although a very big chunk of the population comprised of slaves, much more so actually than in early America, we should respect our founding story much more. Human history is always messy, ambiguous, and never really one-sided, and popular discourse is incredibly immature when it comes to this. What I do want you to take away from this section is that throughout American history, we've had a steady transformation. America started as a highly elitist country where politics was something for the affluent and highly educated gentlemen. And only over the decades, it pivoted to politics of the common man, democracy as we'd call it nowadays. As an anecdotal example, using Google, we can see that even the use of the word democracy became much more popular only in the mid-20th century, which brings us to the next important question of the video. Is democracy really under attack, as we're led to believe? To understand if democracy is is really under threat, we need to go one step back. Do we really live in a democracy in the first place? Because as we've already established, strictly speaking, we have a republican form of government, where the people elect politicians to represent us. Practically speaking, the meaning of the word democracy has changed greatly from the War of Independence to today. Nowadays, democracy merely means that political power comes from the people through voting and rights. It means that we have free and fair elections with separation of power and checks and balances. For the remainder of the video, I'll refer to democracy using the modern definition of the word. As a warning, I try to be as neutral in the first part of the video. For the remainder, I'll still try to remain as unbiased as possible, but I'll be more subjective. So, did we live in a democracy over the years? Kind of, not really, but also yes. It's complicated, actually, I would say. If democracy is the will of the people, then we have to go one step back. What do the people actually want? And how do the people know what they want? Not to get esoterical here, philosophers have been arguing about the existence of free will since forever. So we'll try to keep it concrete. Let us take arguably the dumbest foreign policy decisions in American history as an example. The recent wars in the Middle East. Sure. People voted for George Bush and even re-elected him, and others voted for the Democrats that supported the Iraq and Afghanistan wars too. So you could say that these wars were the democratic will of the people. But did the people actually want the wars? And if yes, why? I mean, why on earth were American troops stationed in Afghanistan? Why did this get so much widespread public support? Well, the people voted for this because there was a weird collusion between politicians, national security, military-industrial complex, the media, and so forth. And so the news organizations, in combination with politicians, whipped up a national uproar where even left-leaning media outlets were pretty pro-war. And so the mass of people watching Fox News and CNN eventually thought that the Iraq War was super patriotic and vital to America's interests. But was it really? I mean, retrospectively, it was a colossal blunder. Or even worse, it was mass murder at the scale of millions of lives and trillions of dollars. And then a few years later, in 2008, people voted for Obama as a pro-peace, anti-war president, who then immediately got a Nobel Peace Prize. But in reality, the Obama-Clinton foreign policy was as bloodthirsty, violent, and destructive as the previous Republican administration. I think you can make a very good argument that people from Bush and Cheney to Obama and Clinton are war criminals, especially Bush and Cheney. Similarly, take the Epstein files under Trump. Despite widespread support for full disclosure, what we've received thus far has been heavily redacted, sanitized information that seems to be more of a distraction than genuine transparency. Kind of as an alibi, as in, oh look, well, we released the files, while the juiciest part is still secret. And by the way, the Epstein stuff has been going on for a few administrations now. It's not just Trump. This points to two very crucial issues with the simplistic notion of democracy is just the will of the people. Pretty much all societies, since the advent of time, are controlled by a rather small and powerful elite. Not in a conspiratorial sense, actually much more practical. As we've already said, humans are fundamentally unequal in ability or agency, and every society will always have a handful of hyper-hungry, driven, and resourceful people. This has been true from the era of George Washington through modern America, as well as in communist workers' republics such as the Soviet Union or China, and on and on and on. The more interesting question is if an elite's rule is justified by competence, such as with the Founding Fathers, or through totalitarian repression, such as in the days of communism. Democracy, in that sense, where the common man decides on what happens, is somewhat of an illusion. However, I'm not making the cynical argument that the people are just dumb and blindly doing what the media tells them. And by the way, I'm also not saying that I myself am not subject to media manipulation. It affects all of us. So I'm not saying that democracy doesn't exist at all. We also live in the real world with real experiences where people voting can really have an effect. An example of this is when the media tried to tell people how great the economy was under Biden, while the people were really and still are struggling. In this case, real-world experience of the people trumped what the media told us. Pun intended. To bring my point home, is democracy real? I'd say absolutely, but much more occurs behind the scenes than what is obvious at first glance. As for the notion that people like Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom and so on are the last vanguards of democracy, I'll give you my take. It reminds me of the Catholic Church in the time of Luther or the Soviet elite in the waning days of communism. They represent a failed ruling class that is on its way out, trying to hold on to abstract ideals as its last lifeline and source of legitimacy. I want to make another video of this in the future, so excuse my lack of explanation. This, however, gets us to the final point of the video and full circle. As a quick disclaimer, guys, there are a lot of AI YouTube channels emerging these days that talk a lot about finance, money, history, and so forth. In my opinion, watching such stuff is really awful because you entirely outsource your brain to robots controlled by forces none of us really understand. For my videos, I do a lot of in-depth research using news articles, academic research, and even books. Of course, I use ChatGPT to double check my thinking and to help brainstorm, but at the end of the day, my videos consist of real human effort. For sure, I'll make some mistakes, but at least there's soul and authenticity in my work. If you appreciate this, a like, comment, and subscribe would be greatly appreciated. But without further ado, let's get back to the video. All the obsession with democracy, not even that I'm against it, but no one ever asks the much more important question. What's the actual point of democracy? What justifies our obsession with it? Because if you think of the founding fathers, they didn't actually want a super democratic system with mass participation. They wanted a very filtered, elitist republic. To give you my take on this, I'll tell you guys a quick story. I was privileged enough to travel to both India and China in the last year, and doing so, I spent around 5 days in both capital cities, New Delhi and Beijing. Both were absolutely fascinating. Especially going to Old Delhi was undoubtedly one of the most memorable days in my life. But my oh my, it was stunning to see how developed, prosperous, and civilized Beijing was, and in contrast, how poor and underdeveloped Delhi was. I mean, people were literally living in piles of rubbish next to train tracks. All of this knowledge is conventional. I mean, everyone knows that China is much richer than India. But I will give you one piece of info that'll shock you. Not long ago, in the 80s and even in the 90s, India and China were both equally poor. They had comparable GDP, both in absolute and per capita terms. Let me reiterate. 40 years ago, China and India were approximately on par. China was incredibly poor in the 20th century. They literally had dozens of millions of peasants starved to death. So what happened? How did China, especially its tier 1 cities, reach such an awesome level of development, far exceeding that of most European and American cities, while India remained, by and large, desperately poor? This is where it gets interesting. India is considered to be a democracy, albeit a flawed one, while China is an authoritarian, one-party state. If we take the Western paradigm that democracy is the only thing that matters, does that mean that democracy is bad and China's nouveau socialism is good? Of course not. Let us not be children. The Chinese political system is certainly mega wasteful and inefficient. That is almost a universal law of big bureaucracies. But the point that people miss is that politics is just the outermost layer of the onion. There are much deeper currents and forces at play, far more profound than politics. We're talking about the civilizational life force. The Chinese people make up one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. There were several times in history where the Chinese stood at the forefront of human achievement. If you zoom out to the scale of millennia, China is the single most impressive civilization on the planet ever. In the 20th century, China was held back by Mao and communism. But once that was done, there was no stopping them. It was clear that China's immense cultural richness would inevitably lead to great prosperity and power. India, in contrast, is arguably the most complicated society on the planet by a large margin. India is more culturally, religiously, and linguistically diverse than pretty much any other region. People in the West like to look at India as a homogeneous blob, but in reality, it is just such an incredibly complex and diverse country. And with this complexity comes chaos and disorder. Does that make India bad? Does it make Indians bad? Again, of course not. What I am saying is that India just doesn't have the cultural prerequisites to reach a level of sophistication like China. Maybe in the distant future, but not in our lifetime. To craft a flourishing society, you need to have a deep, cohesive, and potent guiding force. You need to have a profound cultural energy that injects vigor into the mass of people, that allows them to collectively, harmoniously, and diligently work towards the greater goal of prosperity and excellence. Politics in that equation is actually secondary. This is, by the way, what American politicians got wrong when they brought the gift of democracy to the Middle East, only for it to end in chaos, anarchy, and genocide. Democracy wasn't the problem here, it was the underlying cultures. And it's also what contemporary Western elites, even more so in Europe these days, get wrong when they mourn over the perceived demise of democracy. You don't fix the society by talking about democracy and lecturing the people about its importance. The actual problem is that the underlying cultures of the West have been in decline for a long time. Democracy in that sense is just like marriage. It only works if you have a shared common vision of the world that allows you to compromise and work towards a greater mission. But if the people that are married are too different, with nothing to bundle their energies, compromise or marriage fails. What the guiding force is different from culture to culture. In the case of America, John Adams, founding father and second president, said it well. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Early Americans were deeply religious, worshipped God, a Christian God, and had higher abstract goals that gave their society vigor and vitality. As Ronald Reagan once beautifully put it, the evidence of this permeates our history and our government. The Declaration of Independence mentions the Supreme Being no less than 4 times. In God we trust is engraved on our coinage. The Supreme Court opens its proceedings with a religious invocation, and the members of Congress open their sessions with a prayer. Early Americans were deeply shaped by English culture and its values of modesty, piety, honor, and justice. Make no mistake, that's what made America and also the British so great. Had you given America to any other culture than the English a couple hundred years ago, America would have never become so impressive. Which gets us to the final argument of the video, and the true purpose of democracy in my opinion. The point of democratic norms like separation of power, checks and balances, and so on is to keep our ruling class accountable, dynamic, and free from corruption. It's supposed to prevent the ossification and fossilization of elite circles that always happens in history. Elections are supposed to inject vitality and vigor to ruling structures and keep them fresh and continually replace the old and self-serving. It's supposed to keep the elite fearful of the people that it's supposed to serve. I will leave you with a famous quote here. When governments fear the people, there is liberty. But when the people fear the government, there is tyranny. That is the point of democratic norms and elections, to keep the rich and powerful in check. But the notion that democracy is somehow the core of Western civilization, in our DNA, the end goal of humanity, is nonsense. The belief that a mere political system is what made the West so great is very shallow. It is just a political system, a great one for sure, but for it to work, much deeper things need to align. And those deeper things are not aligned anymore, leading to increasingly dysfunctional politics. That's the end of the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I put a lot of effort in it, and it became quite a lot longer than my previous videos. And as always, I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.